Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into a source that, honestly, kind of flips the whole idea of salvation on its head. It suggests that maybe, just maybe, salvation isn't only a personal journey, but something that can be shared and even given to others, including those who've already passed away.
So let's just jump right in. The text we're looking at today kicks off with this exact question you see on the screen. It's a pretty provocative starting point, right? And it's really the launch pad for this whole argument that salvation is way more accessible than a lot of people are taught.
Okay, so the first major point from this source is that salvation actually extends beyond just your personal belief. And to make this case, it starts with a biblical story you probably know, but, well, it interprets it in a very unexpected way.
The source really builds its entire case on this foundational idea right here, from the Gospel of John. The key thing to grab onto is the claim that Jesus has the authority to grant life to, well, to whomever he chooses, whether or not that person has explicitly said, "I have faith." Now, this is where that idea gets put into practice in a really fascinating way. The source points to the story of Simon the Pharisee, and it argues that Simon was forgiven simply for the act of welcoming Jesus into his home, even though the story makes it clear he was full of doubt. And this brings us to a really crucial distinction the source makes, as you can see here. There's a difference between believing in Jesus in your head and the physical act of receiving him through kindness or hospitality. The argument is that this act of receiving is, in and of itself, a path to salvation. So, of course, this leads us to that classic theological question, right? What's the deal with faith versus works? Well, the source we're examining offers a very specific, kind of nuanced clarification on this. The source definitely acknowledges this super famous verse, which seems to pretty clearly say salvation is through faith, not works. But then, it makes a pivot, arguing that we often misunderstand what the word works actually means in this context.
In this slide just perfectly captures the core of that argument. The source basically splits works into two categories. On one side, you have works of the law, trying to follow all the commandments. And on the other, you have good works, which it defines as real, tangible acts of mercy and compassion for other people.
And building on that, the text argues that these good works of mercy are so incredibly powerful they can actually grant eternal life. It points to the judgment of the nations in Matthew 25, where people aren't judged on their faith but on their compassionate actions, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked. It fulfills that idea that mercy triumphs over judgment.
And it uses this verse from the book of James to really hammer the point home, that faith is ultimately made complete. It's demonstrated through these tangible actions of love and mercy.
All right, now the argument builds to an even more radical idea. So get this. Salvation isn't just something you receive for yourself, but a gift you can actually give to other people.
The evidence for this, according to the source, comes from this verse right here, and it highlights that plural word, men. The interpretation is that the authority to forgive sins wasn't just kept by Jesus alone, but was actually transferred to his followers.
The source then lays out this pretty straightforward three-step logic you see on the slide. 1. Jesus has the power to forgive. 2. He gives this authority to his disciples. And 3. Therefore, the church itself can grant forgiveness here on earth.
And this idea of transferred authority, the source claims, is what provides a scriptural foundation for certain church practices, like the formal granting of forgiveness by councils or through things like indulgences, which historically were understood as ways the church could step in and remit the punishment for sins.
So this idea of a shared or transferable salvation then expands even further. It goes beyond the formal church structure and right into our closest relationships, our families, and even our friends.
The source highlights this famous promise made to the Philippian jailer as some key evidence. The idea is that one person's faith can, in fact, provide a sort of spiritual covering for their entire family.
And then it points to the story of the paralytic. Now, what's so interesting here is that Jesus explicitly forgave the man's sins based on the faith of his friends, the ones who carried him up to the roof, not necessarily his own faith.
And you see the same pattern again, the source argues, in the story of Jairus' daughter. A father's faith is positioned as the absolute key to saving his child, even from death itself.
Okay, so if we follow this logic, the argument reaches its most unconventional point. It asks a pretty stunning question. If one person's faith can save the living, what about those who have already died?
To answer that question, the source introduces this doctrine of baptism for the dead. And as the slide lays out, this is a practice where a living person gets baptized on behalf of someone who has died, with the specific goal of securing their salvation.
The source interprets the Apostle Paul's question here not as a criticism, but actually as proof that this practice was happening in the early church, that he wasn't condemning it, but rather using it as an example, that its premise of helping the dead was considered valid. And the ultimate authority for all of this, the text argues, lies with Jesus himself. He's described as literally holding the power over both death and the afterlife, the keys of Hades and of death.
So, this all leads to a final, pretty startling conclusion from the source. For anyone who has died but has not yet faced a final judgment, salvation is actually still on the table, still possible, through the faith and the actions of someone who is still living.
So after exploring this whole argument, we're left with this one final, really provocative question. It totally challenges the common view of salvation as just a purely individual journey, and it reframes it as this deeply communal, interconnected responsibility. It's a lot to think about, isn't it?